In this video, we're going to be reviewing the cell membrane and cell transport. Both of these are relatively complicated concepts and appear frequently on the MCAS, so make sure you ask questions if you have any. First thing to know about the cell membrane is its functions. Cell membrane protects the cell, helps move substances and messages in and out, and helps maintain homeostasis. Remember, homeostasis is balance. When we reviewed macromolecules, we talked about how your cell membrane was made up of lipids. Now, since we're reviewing the cell membrane, we'll talk a little bit more about these lipids. These lipids are specifically referred to as phospholipids. They have a head and a tail, and remember that the head is hydrophilic, which means it loves water, and the tail is hydrophobic, which means it hates water. In the case of a cell, water is inside and outside the cell. Therefore, the tails need to be protected on both sides, and this is what causes the formation of a lipid bilayer. If you were to look at the cell membrane in every cell, whether it's prokaryotic or eukaryotic, you would see this double layer of phospholipids called a bilayer, bi meaning two. What do the proteins do in your cell membrane? Well, if the lipids are making up most of your cell membrane, if you look specifically at this picture, the little yellow circles are all lipids, so most of your cell membrane is actually constructed of lipids. What the proteins do is they help molecules move in and out of the cell. If you look here, there's one protein. A vocab word that's important to review is semi-permeable or selectively permeable. Semi-permeable means the same thing as selectively permeable. Basically what it means is only certain molecules can get into and out of the cell. They either have to be able to get through the lipids by dissolving, or they have to be small enough without a charge so that they can travel through the protein, like the protein were a tunnel. Now that we've briefly talked about the cell membrane to review, let's talk quickly about different types of transport. We'll start by talking about passive transport and the different types of passive transport. The important thing to remember for all passive transport is no energy is required for it to occur, whether we're talking about diffusion, facilitated diffusion, or osmosis. A vocab word that will help you in our talk of cell transport is concentration. Concentration is basically the amount of stuff you have in a given volume. So for instance, if you have a lot of stuff, we say you have a high concentration. Or if you only have a little stuff, we say you have a low concentration. Typically, things want to move in the direction of being very crowded to being able to spread out. So they want to go from a high concentration to lower. Diffusion is, in general, just the movement of molecules from high to low concentration. This can be any type of movement. You could spray perfume in a room and it would diffuse from the bottle into the whole room. In the cell, this could be any sort of molecule, like let's say oxygen or carbon dioxide, that are small enough to get through the lipids. And as long as they're going from a high concentration, let's say there's a high concentration of oxygen in your alveoli, to a low concentration in your capillaries, that's called diffusion. Osmosis is different because osmosis is only the movement of water. If water molecules are moving, then you have osmosis. When we talked about this the first time, and also when we talked about anatomy, we talked a little bit about hypertonic and hypotonic solutions. Hypertonic means outside of the cell is more concentrated than inside the cell. Therefore, if we think of it as maybe the cell is in a very salty solution, the salt is going to suck the water out of the cell, and the cell is going to shrink up. Hypotonic, think the cell is going to explode. This happens if maybe a cell were taken from a typical human body and put into a glass of water. If the water is pure, then all the water is going to flood into the cell, and the cell will explode. The last type of solution is called isotonic, and really it's just important to keep in mind usually your cells are in isotonic solutions. Isotonic means your cells are staying the same size because water is moving in and out at the same rate. This is the perfect solution for your cells to be in. Alright, check yourself with these two problems. Again, this is a little bit difficult, but if you remember the word salt sucks, that can help you. NaCl, again, is just the science term for salt. If we look at the first example, we see that there's a higher concentration of salt outside the cell than inside. Therefore, water will move towards the salt, and the cell is going to shrivel up, making this hypertonic. If we look at our other example, now there's more salt inside the cell. Water rushes in to dilute that salt. The cell might explode because it's in a hypotonic solution. If you couldn't figure these two problems out, make sure you ask a question before moving on. Now we're quickly going to go over some other types of transport. Facilitated diffusion is another type of passive transport, and basically it's just transport where a protein channel is used. This is the type of transport that might have allowed glucose to get into the villi and into our circulatory system. It might have had to pass through protein channels because glucose is too big to just go through the lipid wall. Just check yourself with these three problems. If you couldn't figure any of these out, make sure you ask. The first question, the answer should have been osmosis. Number 2 should have been facilitated diffusion. And the last one should have just been diffusion. And now we'll talk about active transport. Active transport, you really just need to know that energy is required because you're moving substances against their concentration gradient, or you're moving it from where there's a little stuff to a lot. Something called carrier proteins or pumps might be used in active transport. So if you see the word pump, think you need to put in energy to pump something, and that's active. Or think, if you're going to a higher concentration, you would need to put in energy to get up there. Versus if you were falling back down to a low concentration, that would be passive, no energy. Last thing we're going to review in this video is what ATP is. We've used it a lot. We used it in anatomy, we used it in cell biology, and we used it when talking about the cell membrane. But just to quickly review, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. If we were to look at the elements in it, you can see that there's nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen. There's also carbon and phosphate. Therefore, we know we're dealing with a nucleic acid. And basically, where it contains energy is between the last two phosphates. That's the high energy bond that when it's broken, the molecule becomes ADP and gives off energy. That's really all you need to know about ATP and the cell membrane and cell transport. If you couldn't understand any of this, ask questions or rewatch part of the video.